It's been a while since we've checked in with our good friend, the White House press secretary, Lady Ginger McFirebush of Alabaster Farms, but I think it's about time we did, because she had herself a real humdinger of a day yesterday. First, in what was almost certainly an instance of accidentally saying the quiet part out loud, she sort of casually remarked that the White House, the executive branch of the U.S. government, is working with Facebook to tag and remove content, and even users who traffic in what the government deems misinformation, the definition of which term is normally something along the lines of anything that is politically inconvenient to the Democratic Party. But it was the casualness, the near flippancy with which the remark was delivered that I found to be the most striking thing about it. But I was equally struck by what she didn't bother saying, what she evidently felt didn't need to be said, which is, yes, we do realize this could be seen as a violation of the people's rights and as an unconstitutional intrusion into their private lives. Because let's face it, one way or another, for one reason or another, pretty much every presidential administration that has ever existed has been hostile to someone's free speech and tried to curtail it, whether it was protesters or journalists or whistleblowers or what have you. But we used to at least get lip service to the contrary. We used to at least get an acknowledgement, even a disingenuous one, that the people of the nation have certain inviolable rights that are guaranteed them by the country's founding documents, and the White House understands and respects that fact. But we don't even get the lip service anymore. In Jen Psaki's mind, and one would have to assume in her boss's mind as well, they don't owe you any explanation for why they want to monitor your social media posts and your PMs and your text messages because, damn it, stanching the flow of misinformation and censoring any content that might disincline someone to undergo an experimental medical treatment they don't want or need is the only thing that matters. And if your silly little constitutional rights get in the way of that oh so important work that we're trying to do, then those rights will just have to be swept aside. Because, damn it, we are in the middle of a pandemic. People are dying. So while you selfishly cry over some notional rights you think you were granted by some white male cis hetero slaveholders back in the 18th century, we here at the White House will be busy protecting the vulnerable and saving lives. So put that in your QAnon pipe and smoke it, you filthy right-wing conspiracy theorists. Oh, and also you're a bunch of racists too, naturally. No. This would have been an honorably inept day's work for any White House press secretary, but our girl Jen, she wasn't finished yet, because amazingly, she found herself completely dumbstruck when she attempted to say the words, "Communism is bad." It was Peter Doocy from Fox News who asked the question, and it was a perfectly reasonable question at that, because Lady McFirebush had just given a whole ridiculous soliloquy about how Cuba's societal problems are naturally all the fault of Donald Trump. And look, we all understand that making creatively deceptive statements is the most important skill one can possess in the job of White House press secretary, but even having said that, this little Cuba rant that Jen did yesterday was some of the most disingenuous stuff you are ever likely to hear from a person who occupies that position. She actually, with a straight face, tried to argue that the current trade embargo and economic sanctions against the Cuban regime were instituted by President Trump. Thus, any problems the Cuban people have today are solely the fault of bad Orange Hitler, don't you know? But in the actual historical record, as opposed to the fever dream land of fairies and unicorns that Jen Psaki lives in, all Trump did with respect to Cuba was to reinstitute the parts of the embargo that had been rolled back under Obama. In other words, the Trump administration's policy toward the communist regime in Havana was exactly the same as every administration since Eisenhower, Democrat and Republican presidents alike, with the sole exception of the Obama administration. So now, Lady McFirebush thinks she gets to lay all 62 years of embargoes and sanctions at the feet of Donald Trump. So Peter Doocy's listening to all of this, and for once we heard a reporter in the White House press corps actually ask the screamingly obvious question. Jen, don't you think some of these people wish to flee Cuba because they don't like communism? This, of course, is the point at which a normal person would say yes, because communism is bad and evil. But Jen didn't say anything like that. Amazingly, such were the mental gymnastics she was putting herself through trying to avoid slandering Marxism. She wound up actually implying that mismanagement, rather than communism itself, is the fatal flaw in the Cuban system. Well, that and Donald Trump, of course. Like, there's nothing actually wrong with living in a communist society as long as you have top-notch bureaucrats who know how to run the thing properly. And this is the same sort of idiocy that we often hear from doe-eyed, dumbass leftist college students who have been assured by all of their pinko professors that Marxist-Leninism isn't actually a failed ideology that always produces repression, suffering, and death. No, they say. It's a perfectly viable system that can produce a perfectly healthy and vibrant society. A utopia on Earth, if you will. It just hasn't been done right yet, is the only thing. And the doe-eyed, dumbass leftist college student, you can forgive that person for their naivete, but you can't forgive it when it is coming from a grown-ass woman who runs the communications department at the White House. When a person in that position starts beating around the bush to avoid saying bad things about communism, I would submit that is a fairly serious problem. But I think Jen realizes by now she screwed the pooch pretty hard on that one, because they actually had to call a second press gaggle late yesterday afternoon where they gathered the whole press corps in the briefing room a second time just so Jen could stand up there and confirm that, yes, she has been authorized to confirm that it is, in fact, the position of the Joe Biden administration that communism is bad. Also, have you noticed how the members of the Open Borders crowd suddenly turn into a bunch of asylum-rejecting, isolationist wall builders when the refugees in question are from Cuba? But I'm sure that has nothing to do with the fact that Cuban Americans tend to vote overwhelmingly Republican. And with that conspiracy theory, Jim Eagle, hit the music, please. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we are doing our part for social justice by installing a new nursing room so that birthing people can do their chest feeding in private. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. Happy Friday. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I first need to apologize for having been absent this week. I landed myself on the injured list for a few days there. So to those who have made inquiries, no, I didn't get banhammered again. At least not yet. But having said that, when my community guidelines strike expires in a couple weeks, provided I haven't gotten another one by then, I think I'm going to have much to say about a fairly wide range of things, so do stay tuned for that. Now, I want to talk first tonight about one of the dullest, most unexceptional men ever to occupy this country's military leadership, and that would be General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We talked about this jackass a little bit a couple weeks back after he gave that embarrassing performance in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, wherein he vomited out just about every tired woke platitude in the entire book, while taking great offense at the idea that anybody would be concerned about woke leftist identitarianism infesting the U.S. Armed Forces. But it turns out that wasn't even the half of it. Now, according to a forthcoming book by a couple of Washington Post reporters, a book which purports to recount the last 12 months of the first Trump administration, General Mark Milley thinks Donald Trump, his former commander-in-chief, is indistinguishable from Adolf Hitler. Furthermore, he apparently feels no compunction at all about referring to all 70-odd million of the U.S. citizens who voted for Trump, the incumbent president, as Nazis and brown shirts. Apparently, Milley said this stuff to a whole lot of people in the days following that photo op that Trump did at Trinity Church across Lafayette Park from the White House, which is the house of worship that the BLM terrorists, peaceful protesters for racial justice, set on fire and partially burned down during their summer of peaceful protests last year. Now, you may remember this incident from the 100% false, lying, disingenuous fake news media narrative that was built up around it, where Trump, the cruel, sadistic despot that he is, had personally shot tear gas canisters at innocent, peaceful protesters who were just minding their own business, singing "Kumbaya, my lord" in a peaceful circle or something, because he wanted to clear the park so he could walk over there for a photo op. Nothing about that media narrative was ever remotely true in any respect. The park was cleared hours before the photo op. The one thing had nothing to do with the other, and no tear gas, no projectile weapons of any kind were used on anyone, but it matters not, because the fake news media crafted exactly the fake narrative that they wanted to craft, just like the fake narrative they've built up around the January 6th insurrection, which, in case you haven't heard, is the gravest assault on our democracy since Admiral Yamamoto keyed his microphone and said, "Torah, Torah, Torah." Or at least it was that, right up until Georgia passed a law saying you can't vote without a photo ID. And now the Georgia voter law is the gravest assault on our democracy, worse than a 9/11 sandwich on Pearl Harbor bread with a side of Jim Crow coleslaw. And you better not suggest that any of this is hyperbole, because obviously that makes you a racist. But irrespective of how anyone wants to categorize the events of that day, and just to be clear, I'm talking about the Trinity Church photo op day and not 6th January, Mark Milley was triggered by it in a big, big way. We already knew about his public apology he issued less than 48 hours after, wherein he dutifully flagellated himself while wearing a hair shirt for having committed the unconscionable act of walking across the street with the president and standing around while some photos were snapped. But we didn't know that he spent the next week to 10 days gallivanting all over Washington, D.C., making crazed references to Hitler and Nazis and brown shirts and the Reichstag fire, and basically all the same references that dumb people make when they're trying to draw historical allegories, and Nazi-era Germany is literally the only world history they know, and they don't even know that very well. And it seems Milley was fully convinced and told anyone who would listen in the days following Photo Op Gate that Trump was plotting a coup d'etat and would refuse to leave office when his term expired on 20 January, which is another unintentional betrayal of his own dumbassery, because, hey dipshit, I got a newsflash for you. You can't stage a fucking coup d'etat when you're the one already in power. A coup d'etat is what happens when you take power from someone else through extra-legal and or extrajudiciary means. So we've established that General Mark Milley is an historically ignorant buffoon who uses terms whose meanings he doesn't even faintly understand, who takes exception to being called woke even when it sounds like he's reading from Webster's unabridged dictionary of the wokestery's language. But the question remains, why does this man occupy the #1 spot among all uniformed personnel in the U.S. Armed Forces? Does he actually believe all the woke nonsense that he so enjoys vomiting out in public? This seems unlikely. When he was pressed by Senator Tom Cotton why he put Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist on the recommended reading list for junior Army officers, he came up with two separate but equally feeble responses. First, he argued that because critical race theory is, quote, a theory that's out there, then people ought to read such books for the sake of being well read. Which is a bit like saying aspiring geologists ought to read treatises on alchemy, or aspiring astronauts should read books on flat earth theory, since after all, those are theories that are out there, and we want to be well read, don't we? And when he was pressed by Senator Cotton on how this particular theory and this particular book will make the U.S. Army a more effective fighting force, well, then he had to rather sheepishly admit that he hasn't even read the book and doesn't know much about the theory. Now, there are two types of general in any country's military. You've got your battlefield generals and you've got your staff generals. You need both kinds. One isn't any more important than the other. George Marshall, for example, never once led men in battle or served in a foreign theater, and he's one of the greatest generals in our history. Our victory in the Second World War owed just as much to Marshall and his administrative skills as it did to Eisenhower or Patton or MacArthur and then their battlefield tactics. Mark Milley has never led men in battle either. As near as I can ascertain, he spent his entire 41-year career in command and staff positions exclusively. Now, at some point, he became a qualified paratrooper in the 101st Airborne because he wears the Screaming Eagle on his shoulder, but he's got no combat jumps to his credit. And look, like I said, there's nothing wrong with being a desk general. The world needs desk generals just as much as it needs great battlefield tacticians. But there is a crucial difference between being a desk general and a political general. Mark Milley is the latter. He is a political general. Being a desk general means you gain your upward mobility by being highly skilled at the administrative aspects of your job. But when you're a political general, you gain your upward mobility by learning to always say what your bosses want to hear, by memorizing the fashionable political catchphrases of the day and being able to regurgitate them on command. But it's even worse than that with General Milley, because he doesn't just regurgitate the catchphrases, he seems to actually believe them, as evidenced by his behavior. If these two Washington Post reporters are to be believed in their forthcoming book, in the days following the silly photo op that wasn't really all that big a deal, now Mark Milley, when he talks, sounds like your typical low-information liberal, the type of guy whose only sources of information are CNN and MSNBC, because that's the type of person, the type of idiot you have to be in order to run around like a headless chicken shrieking to the heavens that your commander-in-chief and all of his supporters are bona fide National Socialist brown shirt stormtroopers. And hey, if you want to be a low-information moron who knows nothing about world history except Hitler bad and Nazis bad, that is entirely your own business. But when you're more interested in understanding white rage and reading dumb books by professional racial arsonists, you need to not be in charge of this country's national defense. And we can't let this week come to an end without recognizing the courage and the bravery and the strength of character and the commitment to democracy that has been displayed this week by the Democratic members of the Texas State Legislature, who, rather than see a bill passed that they didn't like, decided to take a booze cruise to Washington, D.C. at taxpayer expense, thus denying their legislature a quorum and rendering it incapable of doing business. Now, if these people actually believed the bullshit that comes out of their lie holes, if this was really an effort to forestall the passing of a racist bill that seeks to disenfranchise minority voters, if your only aim is to deny a quorum to the legislature, then why not just carpool across the state line to Oklahoma? Why do you have to charter a private jet to Washington? What business do you have in Washington? Why are you all going to restaurants and taking picture of your dinner like you're a bunch of dippy, smiling, happy tourists? I thought this was a somber decision that you only undertook as a last resort because you had to save our democracy. Why are you soaking up plaudits from Vice President Black Mask Grim Reaper Ninja Lady? Why are you acting like self-styled TV stars basking in your newfound celebrity? But my absolute favorite thing about this? That was when they suddenly broke into song and started singing "We Shall Overcome," which, totally is not insulting to the generation of black Americans who were alive when that song was composed, many of whom had actually been held in slavery, most of whom were still then living under conditions of systemic racism back when systemic racism was a real thing that existed. Nope, you will not even contemplate questioning the status of these booze cruisers as bona fide 21st century civil rights martyrs who bravely declined to show up for work while still collecting their salaries, who courageously took their ball and went home rather than accepting a result they didn't care for, who had the strength of character to appropriate a 19th century slave lament as the theme song for their booze cruise vacation to the nation's capital, and whose moral convictions are so strong they didn't feel a single pang of guilt about shutting down the Texas legislature so they could take a fun trip and charge the entire bill to Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer. Also, I very much enjoyed the group photo they took on the airplane where the assemblage of people is about 90% overweight middle-aged women and 10% dutiful male handbag holders, because that's rather a delicious little microcosm of the American left, I think. And that's it for tonight. Stay tuned for a possible Saturday special tomorrow. And in the meantime, get off my lawn.